Let me start by saying that I'm a single father and have been raising my 7-year-old son on my own for that entire 7 years. His mother tragically passed away. It wasn't actually during the birth itself, but it was in the few days after that she passed away. She always had quite poor health, but was desperate to have a child, and so even though she was at quite a huge risk, we ended up going through with it. The kid was not planned at all, but once we knew, she could not bring herself to get rid of it, even if it meant putting her own life at risk. Some days I hate her for it and wish that she was still around. Other days I guess I just completely understand. This doesn't mean I would trade my son away or that I hate him or anything. I just miss her. Anyway, what I'm about to tell you happened just in the last few months actually, and is something that I still cannot quite get my head around. I figured that writing my story down and sharing it with people might help me find some kind of answers, or heck, might at the very least have me stop feeling so worried and anxious at all times. My son was a pretty quiet and reserved kid. He liked to stick to his hobbies, and once he got into the zone, there was no getting him out of it. He was pretty shy and not really good with new people, but once you got to know him, that's when he really came into his element. It's when he had some real confidence. I started noticing some changes in him over the last few months though. On their own, they weren't really a cause for concern, but it ended up escalating quite quickly. I remember that one night it was around midnight, and I could hear my son sobbing, so I immediately opened up his door and asked him what was wrong. He had tears running down his face, and he was just shaking his head and telling me, "I can't tell you, he will hear." I was a little bit worried at this point, and so I sat down and asked him what he was talking about. I did my best to try and calm him down and let him know that he was not in any trouble and that no matter what happens, I would be here, and nobody could ever hurt him while I was. He wiped his tears away, and I guess he felt comfortable enough to not have the covers wrapped tightly around himself and his face anymore, so he sat upright in the bed. He asked me to come closer because he wanted to whisper it to me. He started telling me about this kid that he met. He said that when he was playing with his action figures out in the mud in the woods not far from our house, this kid came up to him to talk to him. He paused for a second and asked me if he had a brother. I told him no, and asked why he would even ask something like that. He told me that the kid looked really similar to him. He said it looked like they could be twins. I asked him what the hell he was talking about. I asked him how they looked similar, and he seemed to stumble over his words just a little bit and could not really articulate what he meant. He just settled for telling me that they had the same straw-like blonde hair and a similar round face. I just thought, oh, okay, so not identical then. I asked him to continue. He told me that the kid was pretty pushy and kept suggesting that they should be friends. He said that the kid came over and grabbed one of his action figures without even asking and started slamming it into the mud and just laughing. My son got really annoyed at this and snatched it back, and he said the other kid really scared him. Apparently, the other kid started shouting something about, "Didn't they teach you that you have to share?" And my son said that he had a very scary look on his face, a really, really angry face. My son then told the other kid that he did not want to play and that they should not be friends, and then he ran back home. I told my son that I was sorry that he was having a bad experience with another kid. I suggested that maybe the kid was just a little bit awkward like him and was desperate for a friend and just didn't really know how to act properly and was still learning. But my son just shook his head really rapidly back and forth. I asked him if that was all or if something else was wrong. He just very meekly nodded his head at me and pulled the covers back up to his face. He gestured for me to move my ear in close again, and he told me, word for word, the kid followed me home. I asked him what he meant, and he again just whispered to me, "I saw him in my room. He crawled underneath my bed." I don't know why, but I felt this sudden pit of dread in my stomach open up, and I shot down to the floor and turned on my phone's flashlight in order to look under there. Obviously, there was no kid there. I felt really stupid for a second. I have no idea why my body reacted that way. I told my son that there was no one underneath the bed. I asked him if he made this kid up, and if it was some kind of imaginary friend deal, but he insisted that he was telling the truth. I was a little bit disappointed in him actually. I drilled it into him when he was younger that making promises about telling the truth was a big deal. I told him that he should think on what he said, and that if it's okay to tell lies. He started sobbing again after that, and I felt like a bit of a villain, but I felt like it was important for my son to have an understanding of honesty and trust. I gave him a chance to make it right and tell me that he was lying, and he doubled down. Things changed over the next few weeks and months. My son got weirder, for lack of a better term. He stopped being as shy as he was, or at least it seemed so. His personality seemed to flip-flop depending on the situation. There are definitely a few weird moments that kinda stand out in my memory upon reflection. Things that make me kick myself and wonder how the hell I didn't see it sooner. Did I really not know my son as well as I thought I did? I remember that on multiple occasions, I caught him having full-blown conversations with himself in his own room, talking about going into the woods by the pool, which is weird because there obviously is not a pool anywhere near the woods, nor is there a pond or a lake or anything anywhere near as dangerous as that. Otherwise, I would not let him go and play out there. I noticed that his voice would get really raspy, and he would change how he was talking each time, going from high-pitched and excitable to sounding like he smoked a pack a day and like his voice needed a rest. Whenever I knocked on his door and went in to ask him to be quiet, it was always like I caught him in the act. He would all of a sudden just start acting embarrassed, and he would suddenly cover himself up in his sheets or hide himself away on the floor. I tried to talk to him honestly, and I reassured him that having an imaginary friend was a totally normal and healthy thing for a kid to do, that he did not need to be ashamed, and that I understood, just as long as he did not take it too far like the other night. This really annoyed him. I'd seen him annoyed before, but usually only if he messed with whatever he was doing or did not let him focus. This was a real pain point in school and something bullies targeted him for. He was quite obviously an outwardly different kind of kid, and they could easily rile him up by making fun of his hobbies or things that he liked. They did it to get a rise out of him. He got really annoyed and started shouting at me that Mark was real. He told me that Mark would hear what I was saying and that I would hurt Mark's feelings, that he would get angry and that he would get in trouble. I was like, Mark and Max, huh? He threw a pen at me. This was really quite unlike him when he was at home. I asked him why he would get in trouble, and he threw another pen at me and told me that he was not talking to me anymore, that I was going to get him in trouble. He then told me that he needed to go to the woods to see him. I told him no, that he clearly could not behave and that he needed to reflect on being disrespectful to adults and how throwing things was not the proper way to react and express our feelings. I grounded him for the very next day. It was the weekend the next day, and usually he would be sleeping in until pretty late in the day, so I knocked on his door to wake him up. He was not in his bed at all. He wasn't even in his room either. I went downstairs, figuring he was maybe eating something and watching TV, but he was not in the house at all. I actually found him in the backyard, right at the very bottom, near where the fence was. I didn't say anything at first because I was just watching him, because it sounded like he was talking to someone. The only problem was, I could not see anyone there when I got closer. I could not really make out who he was talking to, so I tried getting a little bit closer, but out of nowhere, my son just spins around and puts his arms out, completely outstretched away from him, like he was trying to cover something. And then he shouted at me, "You're not supposed to interrupt our private conversation. It's rude." Now I was really starting to get pissed off. I'd like to think I'm a pretty calm and rational dude most of the time, but I just could not understand the sudden change in my son's demeanor. I told him to get over here right now. At first, he shook his head, but when I stared at him for a second, he trudged over to me. I asked him if he was speaking to Mark again, and he stayed quiet for a moment. I had to repeat myself before he said yes, very quietly underneath his breath. I told him that Mark was not real and that this needed to stop right now, that he was starting to act differently and misbehave. I told him that it really wasn't like him and that it was not okay. I told him that he needed to stop, that he is not allowed to talk to him anymore. This made him furious. He told me how he needed to go into the woods to play with Mark today or he would not forgive him. I told him that it wasn't happening, and he spent all day throwing a hissy fit, refusing to eat his food, and just generally trying his best to ignore me. I knew kids would be like this, but I didn't think it would happen so soon. I did not think he would change so suddenly like this until puberty at the earliest. He was tucked up in bed, without me even telling him to be that night, which was also odd. He always tried to squeeze out as much time being awake as possible as he possibly could. He liked to maximize his time doing other things. But when I checked on him, he was wrapped up in his covers, and at the very least, he had his eyes closed. I woke up with a fright, and when I checked my phone, it was around 5 a.m. and the sun had not fully come up yet. It sounded like a window slamming shut, so I went to investigate. I shouted for my son and asked him if he was awake, but he did not respond to me. When I went into his room and I flipped the light on, I noticed that he had his eyes wide open and he was just staring at the ceiling. I asked him if he was okay and if he knew what that sound was. He looked at me so strangely for a moment, and then he just shrugged his shoulders. Only, when he did so, I could see his pajamas slightly underneath. I had to rip the covers off of him to be sure I was seeing what I thought I saw. His pajamas were completely covered in mud. It looked as if he had laid down on the floor and rolled back and forth like a pig would. I asked him what the hell happened to him, and all he could do was just stare at me. I asked him if he went outside into the woods at night, after I expressly told him not to. He nodded his head. I asked him why, and he just told me. I wanted to. Now I was really furious. I couldn't really keep the anger in. I told him just how dangerous and stupid what he did was. That at that time, absolutely anyone could have found him and hurt him and taken him away. That I had no idea where he was, and if something did happen, then I would not have known to get help for him. That he could have ended up anywhere with anyone, and maybe could have never seen me ever again. I wouldn't usually raise my voice like I did, but it was clear that he wanted to push boundaries and did not understand how what he was doing was not safe. He just continued to stare at me. He kept on nodding every so often while I was going on this shouting spiel, like he was letting me know he was still listening. It was so calm and odd coming from a child. Normally, he would just cry. Raising my voice had always been a surefire way to make something stick into his head, and it would usually make him cry. And the sudden change in how I was speaking would make him really pay attention and make it stick in his brain. But he didn't cry. He didn't really seem to care at all. I told him that was it, that until further notice, he would not be allowed to do anything other than go to school and then come straight back home. That if he wanted to go outside, then we would do activities together under my supervision. Otherwise, I could not trust him to be responsible anymore. This grounding went on for a couple of weeks. He seemed really different again. He wasn't really all that interested in his hobbies anymore. He really did not want to hang out with me either. Usually, he would love to sit down and tell me about whatever he was into right now. He would sit there for ages and just tell me like all of the hidden details and all of the intricacies. And sometimes he would do little doodles and stuff on a whiteboard and stuff to help me understand his hobby before explaining what he was working on. This was one of his favorite things to do. He loved having a captive audience to just sit and listen, but he stopped doing this entirely, and I felt really guilty. After a few weeks, I thought it might be best for him to have some company his own age. So I arranged for his 2 cousins on his mother's side to come and stay for a night or 2. The first boy was the same age as him, I will call him cousin 1, and the younger cousin was around 2 years younger, I will call him cousin 2. My son did not see these cousins that often. They were very different and did not always get along while playing, but I figured that it would be better than nothing. It did not go how I planned at all. It only seemed to make my son act out more, and I was seriously grappling with the fact that I might have to take him to see a specialist. At first, it was just words and being a bit of a brat, but he started actually hurting people. Let me explain. I was just upstairs for a few minutes. I had messed up dinner because I was trying a new recipe and I ended up spilling some on my clothes and it kinda tasted like crap. I figured that they would be okay downstairs for just a few minutes. I was never ever a good cook. That was always my wife's superpower. And sometimes, I like to try to learn every now and again, because even though it sounds weird, it was my way of still feeling close to her after all of that time. Out of nowhere, I suddenly heard cousin 1 shouting my name, so I rushed downstairs quickly. I found cousin number 2 sitting down on the floor, holding his stomach and retching. There was a bottle of dish soap right in front of him, and I was panicking, asking him what happened. In between bouts of burping and gagging, he was telling me that it was my son's fault. I was frantically getting cousin 2 a glass of water and forcing him to down it, and after that, I was calling my mother because, well, I had no fucking clue what to do. I didn't know whether he immediately needed to go to the hospital, or if I needed to do something else and just check on him. I didn't want to cause myself unnecessary financial trouble if it wasn't needed. She told me to give him some water to dilute the soap and just check on his breathing and keep checking to see if he's okay. If he couldn't breathe well, I needed to rush him to emergency ASAP. I begged her not to tell his dad just yet and that I wanted to talk to him personally after sorting things out. Cousin 2 told me that he only had a tiny amount, toothpaste sized. I was asking him his side, and my son was freaking out while I was doing this, asking me how I could believe some random kid is what he said to me over his own son, how he didn't do it, and he continued on like this, having a tantrum. I hadn't even said anything bad to my son yet, or even told him that I did not believe him, so it just reeked of a guilty conscience. So I asked him to shut up so that I could figure things out. Cousin 2 said that my son tricked him. Apparently, he told cousin 2 that it was applesauce, and when cousin 2 told him that he was lying, my son apparently got mad and forced him to eat it. I could not believe what I was hearing. I asked cousin number 1 if this was true and if he saw what happened, and he was just now sitting on the couch, looking rather shell-shocked, telling me that he did not see anything. Cousin number 2 thankfully ended up being okay. My son spun me a tale about cousin number 2 taking it from the cupboard and doing it himself, and that he actually came over to stop him and save him. I just didn't buy it. Why would cousin 2 lie about something like that? I did not want to waste my breath screaming while his cousins were here and set a bad example, so I gave him a stern warning about being kind and told him that we would be having a proper chat later on. Fast forward to that night. All 3 kids are sharing the same room. I had blow-up beds for them to sleep on so that they could share a room and have fun. Cousin number 1 actually asked if he could sleep in my room, and I told him that he couldn't. He looked really sad when I said this. Anyway, I heard my son talking to cousin number 1 pretty late at night, way past their bedtime. It really annoyed me because I had not had much sleep those last few days. So I got up, but instead of pulling open the door right away, I stood and I listened for just a little while. My son was going on about those damn woods again. He was basically harassing cousin number 1 about them, telling them that he wanted to take him there and show him the pool. Cousin number 1 kept saying how he didn't want to and how the woods actually scare him. My son was getting progressively more pushy and annoyed, telling cousin number 1 that he had to, that all kids like playing in the woods. He started calling him a pussy and asked cousin number 1 if he was actually a man or just a little girl. Cousin number one told him to shut up and told him that he was not going and that was final. My son told him that he would make him. I shut that down very quickly. I forced my son to get up and to bring one of the mattresses and to come and sleep in my room. I let cousin number one sleep on my son's bed instead. I told him to be quiet and not to argue with me. I told him that we would be having a talk about this in the morning. Fast forward to that morning. His cousins went home early and I had a talk with their father and apologized. He was pretty sympathetic about the whole deal and told me that he knew how hard it could be. He told me that he could not imagine how much harder it must be without my wife around. He told me not to beat myself up too much and that kids can act out like this sometimes, especially when a loved one is not part of their life. Over the next few days, I felt like my son was mellowing out a little. He was back to being quite quiet, but he still was not doing much of anything. I remember hearing a meow coming from the living room window, and he actually rushed all the way down the stairs to the window. I have no idea how he even heard it from all the way up there. This cat was a stray and had been around here quite a few times before. It was this skinny little orange thing that would roll around and beg for attention, and my son loved it. It seemed like maybe he was getting better after all. I encouraged my son to go outside and pet the thing. I thought it would do him some good. He seemed really shocked at the words coming out of my mouth. He stared at me for a moment, and I said, "Go on, before I change my mind." And so there he went. The cat was pretty trusting and seemed happy to see him. I went on about my day, and I got on with some laundry. The next part, I can still hardly believe it myself. I know that it might be a bit too much for some of you, and I understand, but I saw this happen. As much as I wanted to make up reasons in my head and deny what I saw, I could not deny this. I could not believe what I was fucking seeing. I actually had to run outside and rip my son away and try to drag him back into the house. I had to do this because he had killed that poor cat. He had his hands around the thing's throat and was squeezing. Not only that, I saw him putting one of its ears into his mouth, and he was full on biting. He bit so hard that I could see that there was a little bit of blood on his bottom lip. This is where everything went wrong. I was screaming at him, asking him how he could do that, and he was fighting against me and trying to break free of my grasp, and he just told me, "You said I could play with it." I was lost for words. This was not my son anymore. My son had turned into some kind of psychopath with no emotions. He managed to break free of my arms, and he started running away from me, towards the part of the fence that would lead to the woods. I screamed at him not to run away, but he was not stopping. I chased him for a little while, and I realized something was very, very wrong. He just seemed so much faster than he actually was before. And maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. But as I was running after my son and struggling to catch up because I was pretty out of shape, I could have sworn it looked like he got a little bit taller. Not dramatically, but just by a few inches. The skin on his legs, especially on the back, it actually looked as if it had been ripped or torn just a little, like maybe he had snagged it on something, or I don't even know. It just didn't look right. It looked painful. It looked like the skin was stretched all the way and coming off. At some point, I just lost him. He disappeared somewhere into the woods, and I could not find him anymore. I heard him laughing like a maniac, and I tried to follow where it was coming from, but I ended up finding something else. I don't know how to explain what I found without sounding absolutely crazy. I found my son, except he was wrapped up in something that I could not really explain. He was covered pretty well in leaves and foliage, and he was actually wrapped in something. It was something that was pretty soft and stringy, but when I tried to remove it with my Swiss Army knife, it felt as tough as rope. It was like wrapped around him multiple times, almost like cocooning him. It was covering his mouth, and I don't know how he could even breathe through that thing. It was like he was wound up tight. He was on the floor behind a tree in some thick cover. I only noticed him because I saw movement. I saw him wriggling around, and he started making these really muffled sounds, and he was coughing pretty violently too, but his eyes were still closed. He looked like he was soaking wet underneath the thing that was wrapped around him, and he had some kind of viscous fluid all over his body. It was all over his pajamas and was staining them, and it smelled really, really bad. It smelled like if you put a few eggs in a blender and poured it over someone's head. He eventually opened up his eyes, but his mouth seemed like it was stuck together, and he had to physically use his fingers to pry open his lips once I managed to get him free. I asked him what the hell was wrong with him and what happened. I asked if this was some kind of sick prank that he had come up with. Maybe he was with the wrong crowd at school and they made him do this. He was crying at this point, just sobbing uncontrollably, and he seemed really overwhelmed and was just begging me to take him home. I told him that we were not going anywhere until he explained why he hurt a poor, innocent animal. He kept crying at this point while telling me that it was not him who did that, and he begged me to take him home right now. I told him that I saw him do it, and he, all of a sudden, in between a fit of tears and really deep breaths, he managed to shout at me, "No, you saw Mark." It was just like the first night that he told me about him. Out of nowhere, I got this horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach. I didn't even really know what to believe or what was going on anymore. When I finally gave in and picked him up and started running home, I almost tripped and fell on my ass because there was some kind of hole in the ground that I didn't really notice at first. It wasn't big enough for me to fit in. It was a little bit smaller, but a little kid could have easily fallen in and hurt themselves. It was just kind of tucked away in between grass and foliage and that kind of stuff, still quite deep into the woods where we were. It was just like this hole that was dug up, but it didn't look dug up, it looked more natural, like a natural formation. And it had some kind of a film over the top of it. I'm not really sure how to describe it. It was almost like, you know when there's like a bubble over the top of something, and it's just kind of this shimmery film. It looked kind of like that. Either way, I did not have time to stick around. I just ran all the way home. I rushed him into the house. I gave him a bath. I tried to get him to talk, but he was pretty quiet. It was clear that he was really traumatized. I did not see anything else while I was out in those woods. Nothing that would give me a real explanation anyway. My only problem now is that I don't know what to do anymore. I've suggested therapy and someone that my son could talk to in private without me hearing so that he could just let it all out, but he is not interested. He really seems like a shell of his former self, and he just seems so unhappy all of the time. When I tried to talk to him about things that happened when he was acting out, he just kind of clams up and gets really sad. He either cannot remember at all, or he denies it. He tells me it was not him. He's been waking up in tears at night these last few weeks and running to me and begging to sleep in my bed. He won't talk to me about it, but I know he's having nightmares. I don't know. I just feel like I've maybe failed as a father, and I also don't know what happened. I don't know how he ended up in the woods like that. I know that there is an obvious answer, but the obvious answer is also kind of crazy. And I try not to think about it, because the only logical options that my brain presents me with, well, let's just say that I do not like them. Okay, so this happened to my sister when she was attending a small university in West Virginia. It was finals week. She's just walking back to her dorm from the library. It's rather late, but there's normally a lot of other people around, so she does not think too much of it. Plus, like I said, finals week, so Everyone is up really late, cramming for tests. She gets a strange feeling, realizing that she is the only person out there. She does not see anyone else on campus, which is really odd. She is walking past a parking lot when she notices a girl her age standing next to a car with the driver's side door wide open. She calls out to her and says, "Hey, I could really use some help. My car battery died. Could you give me a jump?" My sister was feeling really uncomfortable with the whole situation, and she says something like, "Well, I don't know anything about cars. Can't you call someone?" The girl gets irrationally pissed off and cusses my sister out. My sister is just about to tell this girl to go and fuck herself when she notices it. There were 2 sets of feet behind the open passenger side door. She said it looked like 2 people crouching behind it. My sister, who is going to school on a track scholarship, hauls ass out of there and books it to her boyfriend's house. As she was running away, she said that she glanced back just long enough to see 2 guys wearing bandanas over their faces standing next to the girl. She calls campus security, but by the time they arrived, the weird girl and her friends were gone. It goes without saying, my mom just about shit herself when my sister told her about the whole ordeal. What the fuck?